The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Pyrenees, casting long, amber shadows across the terrace of the Château de Vallon. It was the final evening of the annual executive retreat for Sterling Vane International, a week-long affair that combined high-level strategic planning with the kind of performative opulence that only a billionaire's ego could sustain. The air was cool, carrying the scent of rosemary and damp earth, a stark contrast to the stifling tension that had been brewing within the glass-walled conference rooms all day. Elena Thorne stood near the stone balustrade, her silhouette sharp against the fading light. She held a glass of sparkling water, her fingers tracing the rim with a rhythmic, nervous energy. Beside her stood her husband, Elias, a man whose presence was defined not by volume, but by a steady, unwavering gravity. Elias was an architect, a man who understood the importance of foundations, and he had spent the last decade watching his wife build a monumental career out of sheer brilliance and tireless resolve. The retreat was meant to celebrate the firm's record-breaking fiscal year, a success almost entirely attributed to Elena's restructuring of the European division. She had navigated complex regulatory minefields and integrated 3 disparate subsidiaries into a streamlined powerhouse, often working through the night while her peers were at cocktail hours. Yet, as the executive team gathered for the final gala dinner, there was a palpable sense of exclusion. Elena was the only woman at the senior vice president level, and the boys' club atmosphere, led by the CEO, Alistair Vane, had been particularly exclusionary this week. Alistair was a man of inherited wealth and borrowed ideas, a leader who viewed leadership as a platform for his own charisma rather than a responsibility to his people. As the guests took their seats at the long mahogany table adorned with white lilies and heavy silver, the clink of crystal and the low murmur of polite conversation filled the room. Elias watched Elena carefully. He saw the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she offered a professional smile to the chief financial officer, a man who had tried to take credit for her cost-saving initiatives only 2 days prior. Elias felt a quiet pride in her poise, but he also felt the growing weight of the disrespect she was forced to absorb as part of her professionalism. He knew that Elena didn't want him to intervene. She was a woman who fought her own battles. But Elias also knew that there was a difference between a professional disagreement and a personal assassination. The main course had been cleared, and the smell of rich espresso and dark chocolate began to waft from the kitchen. Alistair Vane stood up, tapping his spoon against a vintage crystal flute. The room fell silent. Alistair's face was flushed with wine and self-importance. He began a long, rambling toast, ostensibly thanking the team for their hard work, but his narrative quickly shifted toward his own visionary leadership. He spoke of the risks he had taken and the instincts that had guided the company through the recent merger. Then, his eyes landed on Elena, and a smirk that was more predatory than friendly spread across his face. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, the very picture of a man who believed he was untouchable. "And of course, we must mention Elena," Alistair said, his voice dripping with a patronizing sweetness that made Elias's jaw tighten. "The decorative jewel of our operations team. I must say, Elena, your performance this year was quite the surprise. I remember telling the board that as long as we kept you at the front of the negotiations, the French regulators wouldn't be able to say no to such a charming face. It's amazing what a bit of luck and a well-timed smile can do for a company's bottom line, isn't it?" A few of the younger associates let out a nervous, forced titter. Others looked down at their plates, the awkwardness of the moment hanging in the air like a thick fog. It was a calculated humiliation, a public dismissal of Elena's intellect, her 3 a.m. spreadsheets, and her tactical mastery of the merger. He had reduced her entire year of sacrifice to luck and a charming face. Elena's expression remained frozen in a mask of polite indifference, but Elias saw the way her hand tightened under the table, her knuckles turning white. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the kind of silence that usually signaled a victory for the bully, but then the sound of a chair sliding back across the stone floor broke the vacuum. Elias stood up. He didn't move with aggression. He moved with the deliberate, measured grace of a man who had already won the argument before he even opened his mouth. He didn't look at the other executives. He looked directly at Alistair, his gaze cool and analytical. "Alistair," Elias began, his voice calm, resonant, and devoid of any jagged edges of anger. It was the voice of a professor correcting a student on a fundamental error of logic. "That's an interesting perspective on the year's success. However, as someone who has had a front-row seat to the actual mechanics of Elena's work, I find your assessment to be structurally unsound." The room went deathly quiet. Alistair blinked, his smirk faltering as he processed the fact that someone was actually speaking back to him. Elias didn't give him time to recover. "You mentioned luck," Elias continued, stepping slightly closer to the table, his posture relaxed but commanding. "I suppose you could call it luck that Elena spent 4 months learning the nuances of Gallic labor law in her spare time, so she could negotiate the union contracts without a strike. Or perhaps it was luck that she identified the 3% margin leak in the supply chain that had gone unnoticed by your previous 3 consultants. From my vantage point, Alistair, what you call a well-timed smile was actually the result of a woman who outworked every person in this room, including yourself, to ensure that the Sterling Vane name didn't become a footnote in a bankruptcy filing this spring." Elias paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't being the hero in a dramatic sense. He was simply stating facts with a precision that was impossible to ignore. He was defending her not as a damsel in distress, but as a peer whose excellence was being obscured by a boss's insecurity. "Success in this industry isn't a matter of aesthetics or fortune," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming even more focused. "It is a matter of contribution. Elena didn't just play a part in the European restructuring. She authored it. She lived and breathed the data while this retreat was being planned. To suggest that her contribution is anything less than the primary engine of this year's growth isn't just a tasteless joke, Alistair. It's a profound misunderstanding of how your own company is currently staying afloat. I'm sure the board, when they review the actual audit of the merger's success, will see the same intellectual rigor that I see every single day." Alistair opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. He looked around the table, searching for an ally, but the energy in the room had shifted violently. The younger associates, who had previously laughed, were now looking at Elena with a newfound sense of awe. The CFO, who had tried to claim her work, was suddenly very interested in his coffee. Elias had effectively stripped away Alistair's power by refusing to play by his rules of petty social hierarchy. He had held up a mirror to the CEO's arrogance, and the reflection was small and hollow. The atmosphere in the dining hall was no longer one of submissive hierarchy. It was as if Elias had cleared the air of a poisonous gas. People began to whisper, not about the joke, but about the Sentinel Project and the European Pivot, the actual names of the initiatives Elena had spearheaded. The focus had returned to the work, to the reality of the meritocracy that Alistair had tried to undermine. Elena looked up at Elias, and for the first time that evening, the tension left her face. She didn't need him to save her, but seeing him stand there, defending the truth of her labor with such quiet, professional dignity, gave her a different kind of strength. It was the strength of being seen and understood. "I believe we were about to enjoy the dessert," Elias said, offering a small, polite nod to the room, as if he hadn't just dismantled the CEO's ego in front of his entire staff. He sat back down, his movements fluid and unhurried. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of forced politeness from Alistair and genuine, hushed conversations from everyone else. The power dynamic had been permanently altered. Alistair retreated early, claiming a headache, but everyone knew he was retreating from the undeniable truth that he was no longer the most respected person at the table. Later, as the guests dispersed toward their private villas, Elias and Elena walked along the garden path. The moon was high now, silvering the leaves of the olive trees. The sound of the Mediterranean waves crashing against the cliffs below provided a steady, rhythmic pulse to the night. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The weight of the evening was still settling, but it no longer felt like a burden. Elena stopped near a stone archway, turning to face Elias. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, though her eyes shone with a mixture of relief and love. "I could have handled him." "I know you could have," Elias replied, his voice soft and warm, a complete departure from the clinical precision he had used at the table. He pulled her closer, his hand resting gently on the small of her back. "But handling someone like Alistair shouldn't be part of your job description, Elena. You've spent the year proving your worth through your work. Tonight, I just wanted to make sure that the truth was the only thing left standing in that room. You are the architect of that company's future, and it was time someone said it out loud, without the jokes." Elena leaned her head against his shoulder, letting out a long, slow breath. The frustration of the week, the exhaustion of the merger, and the sting of the CEO's words seemed to evaporate into the cool night air. She felt a profound sense of validation, not because she needed her husband to confirm her success, but because he was the one person who truly saw the cost of it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me," Elias murmured, kissing the top of her head. "Just keep building. I'll always be here to make sure the foundation stays solid." They stood there for a long moment, two people bound by more than just a marriage, but by a deep, mutual respect for the effort it takes to excel in a world that often tries to diminish it. As they walked back to their villa, the lights of the chateau glowing behind them, Elena felt a renewed sense of purpose. The retreat was over, but her rise was only beginning. And she knew that no matter how loud the detractors became, she had a partner who would always speak the truth in the silence.